Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we began to lay out the so-called mind-brain identity theory, advocated by J.J.C. Smart. Smart argues for the identity theory on the grounds that it's simpler than the dualistic and behaviorist competitors. In elaborating his view, he makes sure we understand that he's claiming sensations are brain processes. Not just sensations are properties of brain processes, but they are strictly and literally identical. And he makes sure we know that his theory is about the nature of minds, not about the meanings of words or our knowledge of minds. It's a metaphysical theory, not semantic or epistemic. Finally, and perhaps a bit surprisingly, Smart denies that the identity theory is a scientific hypothesis. Why? Here, Smart distinguishes his way of thinking about the identity theory from that of his fellow Australian philosopher and identity theorist, U.T. Place. He says, "I wish to conclude by some remarks on the logical status of the thesis itself. U.T. Place seems to hold that it's a straight-out scientific hypothesis. If so, he's partly right and partly wrong. If the issue is between, say, a brain process thesis and a heart thesis or liver thesis or kidney thesis, then the issue is purely empirical one, and the verdict is overwhelmingly in favor of the brain. The right sorts of things don't go on in the heart, liver, or kidney, nor do these organs possess the right sort of complexity of structure. On the other hand, if the issue is between brain or heart or liver or kidney thesis, that is, some form of materialism on the one hand and epiphenomenalism on the other hand, then the issue is not an empirical one, for there's no conceivable experiment which could decide between materialism and epiphenomenalism." Here we can make sense of Smart's qualification by hearkening back to our earlier discussion of empiricism and verificationism. On the one hand, Smart says, if the scientific hypothesis is that it's brains rather than hearts, as the Egyptians and Aristotle thought, that is where thinking happens, then there's no doubt that the scientific support is for the brain state thesis. If so, the mind-brain identity thesis is an empirical hypothesis, and it's one that's well supported. But that's not the relevant alternative. Smart isn't proposing the mind-brain identity theory as an alternative to the mind-heart identity theory. The alternative is supposed to be dualism, the theory that mental processes are processes in an immaterial mind, or, as Smart puts it, the alternative is epiphenomenalism. Because there's no good solution to the problem of mental causation for dualists, Smart takes it for granted that dualist theories will have to embrace epiphenomenalism, the theory that minds and bodies don't interact. But, according to epiphenomenalist dualism, even though minds and bodies don't causally interact, they're in perfect correlation with one another, so there will be no possible observation that can distinguish minds and bodies. Here, because Smart accepts the empiricist viewpoint that scientific claims must be subject to experimental checking, he feels compelled to deny that the mind-brain identity theory is a scientific hypothesis. He doesn't say much about what kind of theory it is, but the gist of his argument is that we have to decide if it's true or false based on broadly theoretical grounds, rather than on specific empirical experiments. These days, there's much less concern about whether a theory must have a crucial experimental test in order to count as scientific. And we have much less concern about recognizing that empirical and scientific theories may be supported by theoretical considerations, even if there's still dispute about how best to explain that fact. So, to make a long story at least a little bit shorter, these days we wouldn't usually deny that a theory is scientific because we favor it on the grounds of simplicity and power. Those are perfectly good scientific reasons to accept a theory. Now back to Smart. Smart compares epiphenomenalist dualism to Philip Gauss's hypothesis that God created the planet Earth about 5,000 years ago with the geological and fossil records already in place just as we find them. The problem with that theory is not that it contradicts any evidence we have. After all, it was custom built to match all possible evidence. No matter what we discover, Gauss can say, well, we find that because God put it there. The problem is the theory implies that many of our accepted explanations about the world are false. For example, we use the same chemical theories to determine the age of the planet that we use to do lots of other things. But Gauss is claiming that chemistry gets it wrong. That's a problem. At the same time, on his view, some things we wish to explain are inexplicable. But from all of this, we don't get any predictive or explanatory powers added to our current scientific theories. The theory that God put everything just where he wanted it doesn't give us any way to predict the future. So Gauss's proposal just isn't a serious contender as a scientific theory. And this is what Smart thinks of dualism as well. Dualism implies epiphenomenalism, and epiphenomenalism is not a serious scientific hypothesis for Smart. But he thinks that implies that alternatives to epiphenomenalism are also not scientific hypotheses either, insofar as they're not favored because they're more empirically adequate. They're to be defended on theoretical grounds rather than on experimental grounds, for it's built into the dualist hypothesis that it will fit all possible evidence. If this is right, what can be said in favor of the mind-brain identity theory? Well, the main virtues of the identity theory are that it takes mental processes to be real by identifying them with brain processes. And because brain processes have causal powers, we can be sure that mental processes have causal powers. And it's easy to see how there can be an explanatory science of psychology if mental processes are brain processes. What about generality? Does the mind-brain identity theory say that the right things have mental states? Before we can tally up the case for identity theory, let's check on some objections to it.